Hello and welcome to the program In Focus. The name is Moe Chanda. Now, Africa's oil and gas industry is entering a new era as the world looks to accelerate its transition away from fossil fuels. And the pressures on the continent's oil and gas producing nations are, of course, mounting. Now, Africa's oil and gas producing nations have a unique opportunity to actually embark on an inclusive energy transition and chart a course toward that sustainable future. So based on McKinsey & Company data analysis, European gas prices have increased by more than 3 times over the past 12 months, and this could result in increased demand for oil and gas. That's from African countries that have the reserves as well as the infrastructure in place to help meet that demand. Turning to Zimbabwe, the commercial discovery of oil and gas by Invictus Energy is well on course and is expected to go a long way in making Zimbabwe a net importer of petroleum. And speaking at the launch of the Petroleum Exploration Development and Production Agreement last year, Zimbabwe's President Mnangagwa said the agreement represented major strides in the country's efforts to tap into its oil and gas deposits, which is a new territory in the country's mining sector, and with providing a framework for progression of the Cabora Bassa project. That's through the exploration, appraisal, development and production phases. So today on the program In Focus, as a follow-up to the last discussion, I speak to Managing Director of Invictus Energy Limited, Mr. Scott Macmillan, on the energy transition in action and oil and gas exploration in Zimbabwe. But where are we at now? So joining me via Zoom, I'd like to welcome to the program Scott. Thank you very much for joining us on the program In Focus.
Hi Mo, thank you for having me and nice to be back.
So we are talking oil and gas exploration, but where are we now? What has been the progress with this exploration stage? And also we want to find out an updated independent prospective resource assessment, if there is any at this point.
Yeah, thanks Mo. So we've had a relatively long journey to get to where we are now, and we're about to enter what I always say is the most exciting phase of any exploration project, which is the actual drilling of an exploration well. So we're going to be drilling the Mukuyu 1 well. So that's to test the Mukuyu prospect, which was previously named the Mozarabani prospect, to determine whether or not there is, in fact, a commercial accumulation of hydrocarbons in the Cabora Bassa basin in the north of the country. So the phase to get here so far has been to assess the basin, its potential through some legacy data that was acquired by Mobil. We then went and acquired some brand new seismic data last year and processed and interpreted that. And now we're drilling one of the targets that we've identified from there. And that will prove or disprove whether there's oil or gas in the basin. So at the moment, Exxalo's rig 202 that we brought in to drill this for the drilling of this campaign, and we're planning on drilling 2 wells. That rig has now is at the well site. The crew's assembling the rig. It's around 130 container loads, 30-ton container loads, I should say, of gear, and then there's another roughly 100 or so further containers of consumables like cement, casing, drilling mud, chemicals, drill pipe, and services gear from Baker Hughes, our well services provider. Things like cementing units, wireline units, measuring well drilling tools, drill bits, etc. So it's quite an endeavour to get a drilling campaign together, and it's a logistical feat. We've moved equipment from every continent on the globe bar South America, I think, for this drilling program, and it's been a lot of preparation, a lot of long nights and hard work, but we're getting close to the exciting part, which is the actual drilling of the first exploration well. And then on the prospective resource estimate side, so we released a couple of weeks ago an updated assessment from a petroleum resource consultancy called ERCE. They've got a couple of outfits. They're primarily Singapore and Australian based, but also a presence in London. And that report is very encouraging, shows the potential for up to 20 trillion cubic feet of gas and 845 million barrels of condensate across 8 stacked targets in the Mukuyu prospect. So I must stress these are prospective resources. And so to put it in layman's terms, it's basically like a pre-drill estimate of the potential volume, but it doesn't mean that it's been discovered. As I mentioned, the only way that we can prove the presence of commercial quantities of oil or gas in the subsurface is by drilling a well or a borehole. And the Mukuyu 1 well that we'll be drilling will be drilled to around 3,500 meters beneath the surface.
Well, I'm glad you actually pointed that out because there have been questions around the exploration and wanting to understand when you're speaking of gas and oil in Zimbabwe, are you saying it has been discovered, or you're still exploring, or there is no there's no information as yet to really clarify and put it out there that yes, the resource is actually there? So at this point, you are at the pre-drilling stage. Correct me if I'm wrong.
That's exactly right, Mo. So we obviously make an assessment of the targets that we're drilling to see how big they potentially can be, and you need to do that to really assess whether they, if those quantities are there, whether it's commercially viable or not for you to continue. If you do discover that, what your minimum volume for commerciality is, and you need to be drilling prospects that exceed that threshold, and not just not just drilling small things that'll never be brought into production because they're unviable. So you do that exercise to identify, firstly, what the size of the potential targets are. Secondly, where exactly to test those targets with, and the trajectories of the boreholes that you need to drill subsurface. So ours is going to be a deviated well. So we're going to be drilling the first 1,200 meters vertically, and then we will incline the well to an angle of about 34 degrees to chase the targets beneath that down to 3,500 meters. So we need to have an idea of where those targets sit, what the optimal place in that prospect to test it is, and then making sure that we give ourselves the best chance by placing the well in the best location, because it is a very, very expensive exercise to drill wells and explore for oil and gas. And you want to make sure that you give yourself the best chance of making a commercial discovery. So that's why it does take a long time. We've got to gather a lot of data before we get to that drilling phase. Unlike in minerals, where it's relatively inexpensive by comparison to go and drill a couple of air core holes or RC drilling that we're used to in minerals in Zimbabwe. So I think that there's also been some confusion as to why it's taken us such a long time. We've actually moved pretty quickly compared to a lot of exploration campaigns that take place on the continent, and typically companies take anywhere from 8 to 10 years to drill their first well. We're doing it in 4, so we've done it very, very quickly.
Now, speaking of the continent itself, after all, we are talking about that energy transition in action, particularly looking at Africa, but with a focus of Zimbabwe on the program today. But there is that McKinsey modeling, which I will speak of, that estimates that African energy demand in 2040 could be around 30% higher than it is today, and that compared with a 10% increase in global energy demand. And it also seems that these dynamics bring challenges that will also need to be negotiated, Scott. So they also need to also create that clear opening for the continent to take stock and reconsider its energy approach. Speaking of those approaches, your take to that?
Look, it's unsurprising that energy consumption is going to be greater, or the increase in energy consumption is going to be greater in Africa than it is in the rest of the world. I mean, firstly, 640 million people in Africa don't have access to electricity, and the primary energy consumption on the continent is fueled by biomass. And if you look at the stats, the average African uses less electricity on an annual basis than one refrigerator consumes in the US or Europe. So clearly that needs to change. And energy consumption has a direct correlation to GDP. So it's important that Africa utilizes its energy resources so that we can industrialize our economies, end energy poverty, improve the livelihoods of citizens and increase the standard of living. And so that means using the natural resources and developing projects to provide reliable and affordable baseload power. And that will ensure that we harvest foreign investment, generate jobs, build up local capacity, create economic growth. And those projects then also, they contribute taxes, royalties, and all the benefits that the developed world have enjoyed from utilizing their natural resources, and often natural resources from places like Africa. I think, though, in looking forward, that Africa can be the real winner amongst this energy crisis that the world is experiencing at the moment. And that's really due to the undeveloped volumes of hydrocarbons and gas in particular that can become the major source of new suppliers that can ensure that not only Africa but the rest of the world continues in its energy consumption and its growth. So I hope that that eventuates, that Africa does increase its energy consumption, because that'll lead to far better outcomes for everyone on the continent.
But then it can be said there are significant obstacles that also pose a challenge to this industry. Looking at the science of climate change, and also considering what happened when temperature rose this high in the past. I mean, the emerging alternatives, renewables, energy efficiency, and some of the dramatic scientific advances in clean hydrocarbons. You spoke about hydrocarbons. Let's talk about the issues that are also being raised in terms of the environmental aspects. Clearly, you want communities to benefit from this natural resource, but there are environmental aspects that are also being brought to question. And looking at your company, climate change issues, environmental aspects, clearly, without doubt, drawing interest. What do you say in terms of dealing with the environmental impact, as well as dealing with climate change, which could also pose a threat?
Yeah, but I think it is a tricky question, and I think that the global consensus seems to be that all countries must quickly achieve a target of net zero. Some are talking about net zero by 2030, some about 2050, and that means trying to not add to greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, balancing out emissions by removing gases, with technologies like carbon capture and storage. But those are very expensive and very, very difficult to achieve, because you need the storage underground for carbon capture and storage. You need the technology, and that's even by big companies like Chevron, who are trying to do it on Barrow Island in Australia, have really failed after billions of dollars investments to do it reliably. So it's a difficult challenge. On the renewable energy front, though, that has come a long way in the last few decades, both in terms of cost and scale. But the reliability aspect of solar and wind, and particularly for large-scale applications, with the need to install battery backups in times when you've got low or no generation, means that it's still uncompetitive compared to traditional fossil fuel baseload, which is both dispatchable and flexible. So it means you can have it on demand whenever you want, and you can ramp it up and down. And for modern economies, that's really the center of it is reliable and affordable baseload energy. I think also the environmental costs of mining the resources to make renewable energy product, whether it's solar panels, whether it's wind turbines, is also something that's often conveniently ignored in the conversation. And this push for Africa to skip this energy phase and go straight to renewables, I think, is very misguided, and particularly because of the development opportunities that are missed out by these economies. So if you look at the investments that take place when developing, whether it's oil and gas projects, whether it's coal projects, the huge foreign investment that goes in, the number of jobs it generates, the skills it creates, the downstream industries that it creates are endless. Whereas pushing African economies now to adopt renewable energy simply means purchasing solar panels from, that 90% of them, and the supply chain is dominated by China. So rather than generating income from the sale of natural resources, you're having to spend money from the fiscus on purchasing panels and not building up any industries. And so, Africa loses out twice in that respect. I think, further aspect is hydrocarbons make up 80% of the energy consumption, and that's barely changed over the last 4 decades. I think, though, switching the mix of hydrocarbons is important, and clearly natural gas is a better alternative than coal when it comes to power generation, and increasing its use. For example, in the US, where their CO2 emission reductions has come from a result, and they've beaten all of their targets that they signed up to with Kyoto, has come from a larger increase in gas from as a result of the unconventionals revolution in the US and retiring a lot of coal-fired power, and that's how they've achieved a massive carbon dioxide emission reduction over the last 10 to 15 years.
But you also, yes,
yeah. So just and then just one more point on this. I think that it seems like a lifetime ago from COP26 and the recent events, particularly in Europe, which is suffering from a severe energy crisis, really highlights the danger to economies and its citizens when energy security isn't placed at the forefront of a country's energy needs, and having too much reliability on renewables and not having that energy security and your own energy supply, which is particularly important, is really coming to the forefront. So I think Africa deserves a just transition and not one that comes at the expense of its development. Whilst the Western world continues to use resources from these countries and simultaneously denying them the ability to develop the same type of resources. I think, that's very hypocritical.
But you also raised the issue around costs. We clearly touched on that the last conversation, financing. But I'm bringing you back to it, to the financing aspect, because African oil and gas aspects are on average 15 to 20% more costly to develop as well as operate. And you find that 70 to 80% more carbon intensive than global oil and gas assets. And as global capital pools for hydrocarbon projects begin to reduce, Scott, analysis suggests the cost of oil and gas production is in Africa expected to rise. So it will also make African oil and gas projects potentially even less competitive in global markets. I want to look at the Zimbabwean project itself. The last time, like I said, we touched briefly. Once again, it seems there's need to appreciate the financing. Indulge us there.
So yeah, on the cost basis of African oil and assets and the competitiveness of it, it is true that, well, it's often true that they are more expensive to develop and operate, and really that's mainly to do around the supply chain and logistics factors, your distance to market, and the availability of goods and services. As well as the expertise for those developments. So, I'll give you an example with our project where, as I mentioned earlier, we've had an enormous logistical exercise to bring in everything for this drilling campaign. So, our wellheads came from Qatar, our casing has come from the UAE, we've had running tools from India, we've had cement from Germany. The rig originally from Poland came via Tanzania and Mozambique. We've got drilling pipe coming from Scotland. We've had cement coming from Houston, wireline tools from Gabon, a cementing unit from the Republic of Congo. We've got mud chemicals from the US as well as South Africa, and the list goes on and on. And so to bring all of those things together at one time and have to freight them all over the planet clearly makes it a larger cost base to work from than, for example, if you were operating in in the United States or Canada or the Middle East, where you have these big supply chains and supply bases and manufacturing capacity for all of these consumables and services. So that's unfortunately just a fact of doing business on the continent, is having these more expensive projects on a kind of per development unit cost basis. What that translates to is that you have to find then bigger fields to make the economics worthwhile and try to bring down that unit cost basis. And also, African governments have become more cognizant of this and have improved the fiscal terms for these jurisdictions to make their countries more attractive to invest in. So if you're an oil and gas company looking at a project and you've got comparable geology and you've got the reasonable chance of discovering oil and gas in both basins and similar amounts, you're going to look to the above ground terms, and that's a combination of the fiscal terms and the operating environment as to where then you're going to go and choose to invest your money to make.
But then,
to make a return. So I'll get to your carbon intensity issue as well. The major contributor to that is the fact that there is a lot of flaring of associated gas, and that happens as a byproduct of oil production. So you have gas that's produced that comes out of solution when you bring oil to the surface, and for the large part, there hasn't been a big market for gas that can be tapped, and also governments have been slack in the regulations and allowed companies to flare gas. So that they can produce oil and they don't forego those revenues. If they just said, well, we're not going to let you flare, then there wouldn't be any production. A lot of governments are now changing and they're demanding that gas is reinjected and saved for later on, so that can be accessed and used for gas developments in the future. We're also seeing now gas become a far more attractive commodity, and saw today that Japan paid an all-time record price for a cargo of LNG, and gas on an energy basis is more expensive than oil at the moment.
But what about?
That is going to.
I want you to also address the revenue accountability, coupled with what you just said. What about that revenue accountability? What guarantees are there, especially for a long time? There has been the resource curse factor also coming into play, which is believed not to benefit even locals, the continent itself, and there has also been issues of corruption.
Yes, so that resource curse is a factor, and it really comes down to a governance issue, and that's why countries have moved now to more transparent and publishing contracts that they enter into with oil companies to ensure that there is some visibility of those contracts, how much revenue is being generated, how that revenue is split, and that's something that we're doing in Zimbabwe. So that is through what's called a production sharing agreement, and that will provide the state and the host government and its citizens with a fair share of any resources that are developed, and that outlines in very, very clear terms what each party's obligations are, what's due to them as a split, either in product or profit from the development, and that ensures that there is that transparency and accountability of that revenue, where it goes, and and who receives it. Whether that's at the local government, at the state or provincial government, and also the federal government. So those have been very important developments recently, and also a lot of Western countries are demanding that companies also disclose whatever payments are made. So there is far more accountability than there used to be. I think for oil and gas as well, from a transportability point of view, you need pipelines, you need metering. It's very, very difficult to smuggle oil and gas and have it unaccounted for, just because of the sheer volume of it and what's needed to move it to market. Secondly, on the on the accountability side of things, though, for a company like Invictus, we're a listed company. We're listed on the ASX in Australia as well as the OTC market in the US, and we publish, everything that happens in the company from an activity point of view, from a finance point of view, and you have to publish production numbers, revenue numbers, and so that provides tremendous transparency in what we do, in what's going on in the project. And anyone can go to our website, they can go to the ASX website, pull up our reports. They're all audited, and they can see exactly how much is being spent in the future. Hopefully, if we're successful and we make a discovery and this goes into development, how much revenue has been generated and where it's all gone. And this is now again all part of company social licenses to operate, and you need to have that support from the community, from your host government, and from its citizens in order to be successful.
Now, I know we have very limited time now. I want us to also focus on the significant risk of a technical and skills gap if the international players continue to divest from their region. So how do you intend to also help address and increase, also looking at strengthening that local oil and gas workforce capabilities, while also attracting as well as investing in the talent, the skills, the expertise needed to grow that sustainable energy business in Zimbabwe? And I also want you to touch on the carbon pricing. I know the time factor there, but carbon pricing, taxes, issues around that.
Sure. So from a divestment point of view and a skills base, I've been amazed at the talent that we have in Zimbabwe, and that we're fortunate enough to have on our team, and what they've achieved for a country that hasn't done this before. It's been incredible to watch our little team go about it and get ready for this drilling campaign. So I'm not concerned from a skills point of view that can be trained up very easily. In more mature countries in Africa, they've developed really good skills bases, and you're now seeing a lot of indigenous oil companies, as well as service companies, really take the lead in some of those smaller assets that are more marginal, that don't really suit the portfolios of the bigger players anymore. That for them the juice is not worth the squeeze. And then it creates more opportunities, because a lot of the majors and the large independents are divesting from the region. And that creates, a lot of options for these newer companies and smaller companies and indigenous companies to take up those assets and take over them and do very, very well and grow that skills base in those countries, as well as Zimbabwe, hopefully in the future. So, and then on a carbon pricing side of things, I think it's inevitable. It's probably the simplest and most market efficient mechanism available to level the playing field. But as we've seen from somewhere like South Africa, implementing it has been too difficult to achieve because of their energy mix being predominantly coal-based, and levying a carbon tax on them would handicap their economy. And so the government has provided waivers for them to continue. From our point of view, last year in our annual report, we mentioned a carbon neutrality plan that we have, and we've been working very hard on that front, and we'll have some material developments that we'll be able to announce very soon once everything's finalized. And it's something that we're pretty excited about, and I think will set our project apart from other oil and gas projects. But that's unfortunately all I can say. At the moment, I can't provide you with any further detail until everything's finalised and we've made an announcement on that front. But yeah, very, very exciting times ahead for Invictus and for the country.
And I'm sure you could say this in as short time as possible, the opportunity in leveraging the energy transition and oil and gas. What does the future look like for Zimbabwe as we wrap it up? If you were to probably put it in 3 words or so, how would you wrap it up?
I would say we need to be pragmatic. We need to ensure that that the policies are put in place to allow development, and also we need to seize the moment when if and when we do make a discovery and bring these into development as quickly as possible so that Zimbabwe can increase its energy mix.
Well, on that note, I'd like to say many thanks to the Managing Director of Invictus Energy Limited, Mr. Scott Macmillan, who was speaking to us this afternoon on In Focus, the energy transition in action, oil and gas exploration in Zimbabwe. Where are we now? Thank you very much for that, and we look forward to engaging you further on this exploration.
Thank you, Mo. Thanks for having me.
Thank you once again. The program has been in focus as we were focusing on oil and gas exploration and having a bit of an understanding and update from Invictus Energy Limited. We will continue to give you follow-up conversations with this regard. But this has been another program in focus. My name is Moe Chanda. It's pleasant listening.